Really just wanted to finish off our series on the Promised King today by looking at Discover the King. I mean, the thing is that we've been looking at, what's he going to be like, how or what characteristics will he have, and what does the Bible say about him, basically. But there comes a point when the Promised King arrives. And when he arrives, the point then is not just to keep talking about the Promised King, but to say, now, how do we find him? So hence today are called Discover the King. And I think it's quite interesting that there are several groups of people in the Christmas story who were sent to discover the King. The first group, of course, would be the shepherds. Shepherds are out in the fields. There they are. They're looking after their sheep at night, it says. The angel appeared to them and told them that the Saviour had been born. And although he wasn't referred to in terms of the king, but underlying the text, it's quite clear that's who was being referred to. That it's the Messiah, the Saviour, who was going to come, Christ the Lord. The Messiah, Christ Messiah, the same word. The Messiah, the Lord. Go and find him. Go and look in Bethlehem for him. And then sometime later, and we believe this could have been up to 2 years after the birth of Christ, that another group came looking for him. Now, isn't it amazing that in between these shepherds on the very day that he was born and up to 2 years later, when the Magi arrive, that we're not told that anybody else was recognizing who Jesus was. And I'm sure that's exactly as God intended it to be. You see, to everybody else, he must have looked just like an ordinary child. There was nothing particularly spectacular about him. We have some stories that are a little bit stretched in some of our Christmas legends. Away in a manger, says one of the carols. Away in a manger, no crib for a bed, the little Lord Jesus lay down his sweet head. And at one point it says, no crying he makes. Do you actually honestly believe that the baby Jesus did not actually cry? The only baby I've ever known that has never cried is Simmy. Simmy never actually cries. Is that true? It's not true. It's just when he's here. He's just on his best behaviour. But apart from that, all babies cry. It's part of what babies do. It's how they communicate. So, of course, he did. He was just like an ordinary baby. I've had several Christmas cards that have arrived this year which show the stable scene. As I've said before, I don't suppose he was actually born in a stable at all. But more of that another time. Nevertheless, in that stable scene, you've got this baby lying on this bed of straw or hay, and there is a definite glow that is coming from around his head. Okay? And do you think that's what actually happened? Do you think that there was a physical glow that was coming from around the baby? No, of course there wasn't. He looked like any other child. He made the same noises of any other child. He acted like any other child did. Because he was fully human as well as fully God. 2 years later, after the birth, and no matter what you think about the stable scene, he's no longer in the stable, okay? The need to be outside, pushed out, in the open, is no longer there. We were told by Luke that there was a census that took place, and everybody was going to his hometown, and Joseph went to his hometown, and therefore, the town would have been crowded because of the census. That would also coincide with, I actually believe that Jesus was born probably in late September or into October. and it was the Feast of Tabernacles, when the Jewish men were commanded to go to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem and the surrounding vicinity would have been full of people. So some have questioned, how can the census coincide with the Jewish festival? Two things for that. Number one, it was a worldwide census of the Roman Empire. Don't suppose that Caesar particularly bothered about the Jewish festivals. And number two is that, they could have still run concurrently with one another anyway. But the point is that if that was the case, there would have been loads of people in Jerusalem at the time for the festival, which would have meant that there was very little room for anybody. And so when they went to the inn, there was no room for them. And they were probably in the courtyard. Middle Eastern inns, that they weren't like, Premier Inns today. You wouldn't have got a building with lots of rooms in several layers and what have you. The inns, they were very different. You have to remember that the inns had to cater for the needs of the people that were there, okay, so their specific needs. One of the needs that a traveller would have, and it would be travellers who use the inn, one of the needs a traveller would have is that they would have had animals probably, many of them, in their travels. Now, those animals had to be kept safe. And so, whereas, if you go to a Premier Inn today, it's probably got a nice big car park for you to stick your car. In those days, they had a nice big animal park. And so what they did was they built a square. And the rooms would be around the square. Okay, they were built into the building around the square. And at one end would have been a gateway, which could have been locked, and you go in through the main gate into the courtyard. That's where your animals were kept safe, and there would have been feeding troughs there, mangers for the animals to eat as well, and to be looked after. And so it seems, almost certainly that when Mary and Joseph came, they knocked on the door of the inn. Sorry, we have no room in the inn. So what do you do when all the rooms are taken? Like so many others would have done, is that you'd have camped in the courtyard with the animals as well. And so, hence, there was the manger. But now, 2 years on, we read that when the Magi eventually found Jesus, they went to the house. So he's no longer in the manger. He's no longer in the courtyard or the stable or whatever it is you want to see it as. He's moved out of there because he's much older now. The crowds have left the area. And they are staying put. We are not told why they stayed put and why they remained in Bethlehem. That is not recorded. My best guess really is that there was probably no specific reason other than, well, this is the will of God, okay, that he intended for the baby to be born in Bethlehem and to be proved that he was born in Bethlehem. And so, because that's what his word says. As Herod found out. So let's talk a little bit about the story for a moment. Because you've got these strange men who have arrived in all their finery. And we always see them on camels, don't we? Did you notice in Matthew chapter 2 where I read, where it talked about the camels? Did you see that? You didn't see the camels? So why do we think of them in camels? Well, obviously, there's a kind of stereotypical person from that part of the world who holds some position, who would probably be riding some sort of animal, likely to be a camel. But I think also that we pick it up from Isaiah chapter 60. We read Isaiah 60 at the beginning, and we read the first 3 verses. And verse 3 says, "Nations will come to your light and kings to the brightness of your dawn." And many have seen that as a prophetic word speaking about these people coming. Hence, sometimes they're called the kings. But also in verse 6, it says this, "Herds of camels will cover your land. Young camels from Midian and Ephah and from Sheba will come, bringing gold and incense and proclaiming the praise of the Lord." So here we have it recorded all the way back in Isaiah, 750 years before the birth. and he's already predicting that you're going to get these people who are going to come from distant lands with their camels, and they're going to bring gold and incense. He forgets the myrrh, but never mind, but the gold and the incense is there, and he sees that a long way off. And this is the nations coming to the brightness of your dawn, as Isaiah also says. And what they're doing is they're coming because they have seen his star. To try and understand that a little bit more, these magi, these wise men, where do they come from? Who are they? What were they looking at? Now, obviously, they've seen his star, so we know that they are astronomers. And the fact that they're looking, let me use the word slightly superstitiously, at the stars, suggests that they are astrologers. There is a difference between astronomy, just studying the stars for the fascination of it and understanding of it, and astrology, where you try to read into it and to see the future. And these guys did a bit of both. And so they looked at the constellations out there, and they believed that they were being given information. Now, we know a little bit about who these people are, and you have to go extra biblically for that, so to go outside of the Bible, although we do have hints in the Bible as well from the book of Daniel. And we do know from outside of the Bible that this group of wise men, these magi, and magi, of course, from that we get the word magician, these were meant to be very wise, clever, even supernaturally powered people who lived in Persia, east of Israel. And Persia is what we would call modern-day Iran, Iraq, that kind of area. But in those days, in Persia, they were a very respected group. And they were advisors to the king because they had special powers to see beyond the natural realm, so the kings thought and the nation thought. And so whenever the kings of Persia had a conundrum, they would call in the magicians, the wise men, to answer their questions. And so one day, King Nebuchadnezzar, who was one of the most powerful of all the Persian kings ever, and one day he had a dream. And quite rightly, though, King Nebuchadnezzar was thinking, do you know what? I think these wise men are a fraud. And that's pretty brave of the king. And so he decided to test them. And he called them all in and he said, I have had a very disturbing dream. And he said, I want you to interpret it. And they all bowed down and said, yes, your highness, tell us the dream. Ah, that's the catch, says Nebuchadnezzar. I'm not going to tell you the dream. You're going to tell me the dream and interpret it. And if you don't, well, frankly, it's off with your heads. So there, if you're really so clever, if you're really magicians, if you can really see into the future, you better tell me what I dreamt and what it means. And they went away, perplexed, and they came back to the king and they said, king, you've asked something that nobody in all the world can do. Nobody can interpret your dream, Nebuchadnezzar. It is impossible. So the king said, well, in that case, the whole lot of you are going to be executed. All the wise men. And so he sent out his army to go and round up the wise men and to have them executed. Now, among those wise men was a man called Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they came to arrest Daniel. And Daniel didn't know anything about this, interestingly. So he asked his executioner, why exactly is the king so angry? And he told him the story. So Daniel asked, he said, can I go before the king and make one final request and plea? Daniel went before the king, and Daniel said, I need time. Just give me a little bit of time. Let me go away, pray to my God, and he will reveal. And when he came back to the king, he came back, and I love the way that Daniel, the first thing he says is that, which was, it's a pretty dicey way to start off your explanation to the king. No man can possibly interpret what the king, or know what the king saw, what went through his mind. Because the king could have stopped him there and then and said, see, you're just like all the rest, that's it. Go and execute them. But thankfully he didn't. He listened. And he said, however, there is a God who is the revealer of mysteries. And he has revealed to me the images and thoughts that went through your mind that night, and has given me the interpretation of your dream. He said, Nebuchadnezzar, what you saw was a huge statue in a human form. And the statue had a head of gold. And then as he went down, it had this chest, which was of a lesser material, and going down to the legs, and then finally to the feet, which were a mixture of iron and clay. And he said, let me tell you, he said, what you saw was, first of all, the head of gold is you, Nebuchadnezzar. You are the head of gold. That means that everything that came after the head of gold must be future kingdoms. And Daniel was actually made chief of the wise men for his ability, which wasn't his ability, it was God's revelation. He was made chief of the wise men, and he oversaw them. Now you can imagine, can't you, that if somebody like Daniel came in and did the absolute impossible that all the other wise men said could not be done, that they took note of Daniel. And Daniel, he didn't actually have many visions and dreams. I mean, I know we have a book of them, but if you actually look at them, they are spread out over quite a long period of time. And so it was only every few years he had these incredible dreams and visions. And sometimes he didn't even reveal those, so I don't think they were all recorded in the annals and the books of these wise men. But the thing is that some of them were, without doubt, because they were royal matters that were being dealt with. They would have been recorded. And we believe that ever since that time, that these wise men had records of what Daniel said would come, and Daniel, no doubt, as the chief of the wise men, had to work with them and be with them on a regular basis. Now, what do you think Daniel did when he met with the wise men? Do you think that he went with their hocus pocus and waving their magic wands? Do you think he did that? Because I don't. Do you think that Daniel stood there on top of his house with a telescope, looking up at the various constellations? I don't, personally. Scripture forbids all forms of divination. That means any form of trying to discern the future other than by one means and one means only, and that is the revelation of God. And so he would have nothing to do with that. These were occult practices. And let me just say, I'm not going to go deeply into it, but if any of you touch anything that has any possible connection with occult practices, leave it well alone. Turn away from it. Even if it seems a bit of fun, it's not fun at all. It's serious stuff that you're dealing with. And so all these dark practices rejected, and instead Daniel was a man of prayer. So I suspect that Daniel actually led the wise men in prayer to his God. Daniel was brave enough to stand before the king who had the power to save his life or for him to lose his life, and was able to declare boldly before the king that no matter what you say, I will serve my God instead. And he did that in chapter 6 of Daniel. The other one, the statue, you'll find in Daniel chapter 2. And in chapter 6, we have Daniel where he refuses to bow down to the image of the king, and to just conform really to all the things that the king is saying, and to pray to him and to ask the king and him alone. And he, every time he stands up, and his friends too, they stand and say, "We will not do this," and they put themselves in danger. The three friends ended up in the fiery furnace, and God saved them out of the furnace. And Daniel finds himself thrown into the lion's den, and God saves him from the lion's den, Because in every case, they just said to the king, you might be the king, but there is one who is more superior to you. And when Daniel, as chief of the wise men, met with them, he would have declared the greatness of his God and declared that there is only one God in heaven, and he alone is the only one who saves. And all this would have been recorded. Now, fast forward a few hundred years, and now we have a future generation of these wise men, and they are still studying their stars, because they always go back to their old ways. They're still studying their stars, and this is the amazing, wonderful graciousness of God, is that somehow or other God spoke to them through the stars. And, some people have said to me, God would never do that. But look, let me just say this to you, and some of you will identify with this. Some of you, before you were Christians, will recall God speaking to you. And he didn't speak to you through the Bible. It wasn't that one day you picked up the Bible and you read something and you realized that he and he alone could save you from your sins. It was something that happened outside. It was something in your life, somebody in your life. It may not have been Christian related at all. I've heard of people who, just something, really simple or seemingly simple happened in their life, not a religious experience, but it turned them to God and they had to think about it and to search it out. And God uses the things around us in order to speak to us as well, particularly for those who are not believers in him. And I think that God took these men and said, look, they spend all their time looking through their telescopes. I am going to speak to them from the sky. And right the way back in Numbers 24 and verse 17, we have the first prediction and prophecy that the birth of Messiah would be announced with a star. And so all the way back there in Numbers, God says there's going to be a star. So we can believe it when it comes up here in Matthew chapter 2. And so in Matthew chapter 2, these guys are looking up and they see this strange bright star. What is it? Well, people, have tried for years to explain the star. And the most common theory is that what's actually happened is you've had two planets that have, because planets, they're sometimes known, in the Bible, they're often referred to as wandering stars. And a wandering star is because, all the stars are fixed in place, aren't they? And although they appear to move across the sky as the night moves on, but actually in relation to each other, they are fixed and they do not move. But there are some of these bright, shining, twinkling things that seem to move position. And so they were called wandering stars, or we know them as planets. And two of these planets, so the theory goes, and they can work back, because planets, they're in their own orbit, so you can work back hundreds and thousands of years to see where they would have been. And people with their computers and charts and goodness knows what else for years have said that there was a time when two of these planets were in conjunction with each other. Now, if one was right behind the other, you wouldn't really see too much difference. But if one is slightly off-centre of another, then you're going to get the brightness of this one and the brightness of that one, which is going to make it look like a super bright star. Now, these geniuses have actually worked out there was one such, these conjunctions between two of these planets, which happened in 2 BC. And therefore, Jesus must have been born in 2 BC, they say. And that the idea that he was born in 6 BC cannot be right. And the fact, actually, that history tells us that Herod died in 4 BC, 2 years before the conjunction. Not sure how that works. There's another problem with that theory. And the problem is this, that how long do you think those planets are going to stay in that position? A day? A week? A year? 2 years? Not likely. They're not going to stay there, are they? No way. So how is it then that these men turned up? And it says Herod found out from them the time the star appeared, and then ordered the slaughter of the children eventually 2 years and in accordance with the time the star appeared. Secondly, when these guys came to Herod and they went into the royal palace and Herod gives them permission to go and find the child, it says they went out and they looked up and there was the star again that had guided them. The star they'd seen in the east. Now, if these guys had come from Persia on camels, it would have taken them literally several weeks to have made that journey. They would have gone, for days and days travelling on their camels to get to Jerusalem. There is absolutely no way that those planets would have stayed in that position all that time. Why do I tell you that? Because conspiracies abound. Don't listen to them. Don't listen to them. What God did was a supernatural thing. It is the only explanation that God put a star. Notice this also, that having guided them all the way from where they were in the east to Jerusalem, when they went out, it says they looked up, they saw the star above them, and it led them and guided them to the very place where he was staying. So it was right above them. And they used what was actually quite technical equipment to judge the position of the stars above them. This star has led them from the east, so it's been going from the east side, from Persia, heading right across to Jerusalem, okay? So it's heading west. When it gets to Jerusalem, it then takes them from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, which was east, so it's now going east of that. So this star, which was going this way, has now changed direction and going this way. And only a little bit, just a little bit, but it was enough that they were able to look and say, this is right over the place. He's here somewhere. Quite remarkable. So I believe with all my heart that God put his star, his guiding light, into that sky. And he put it there for a long period of time to bring the nations to worship Jesus. Notice then that Herod says, not surprisingly, gulp, what are you talking about? They're looking in a royal palace. They're looking for a king. Herod was about 70 years of age and his health was not good. And suddenly he hears that somebody else has been born as king of the Jews. And Herod must have been really disturbed. In fact, it says he and all Jerusalem was disturbed with him because a king of the Jews had been born. And this king of the Jews, something remarkable about him, because I've said on previous Sundays that he wasn't just born king of the Jews. Well, he was born king of the Jews, but that was never his intention. His intention was king of the nations. So he intended always to be king over everyone. But Herod knew that when they said the king of the Jews had been born, he knew what that meant. The Jews were looking for their Messiah. They were ruled by the Romans, and they were looking for someone to come and throw the Romans off of them and to give them freedom. And they thought that freedom was going to come through Messiah. And so we find that later on in Jesus' ministry, when it says that they came to make him their king by force, believing that he was the Messiah, believing that he would be the one who would overthrow the Romans. It says that Jesus pushed through the crowds and walked away from them. So they were looking for Messiah. Everyone was talking about it. And Herod is now threatened and upset, and someone is going to steal my throne from me, because he knew that the throne didn't belong to him anyway. He was a puppet king put there by the Romans. He wasn't even a Jew. He was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau. He wasn't a descendant of Jacob at all. And so finally, he calls in the Jewish leaders, and he says, tell me more about Messiah. You keep talking that Messiah is coming. Tell me, where will he be born? What can you tell me about him? Well, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. The prophet Micah says so. He's going to be born in Bethlehem. And that's where you'll find him. Now, some people have wondered, why is it then that Herod didn't shoot straight off to Bethlehem and search himself for the child? Why wasn't he proactive in the first place? And I think there are all sorts of theories for that, but let me just say to you, I think the best reason is this, that he did at least respect the Magi. These Magi, they were not just a bunch of, stargazing nutters. These were serious guys. They had a heritage that went back hundreds of years, and their role, let's say, as the wise men of Persia, was also that they were considered as the kingmakers. In other words, they were the ones who approved the appointment of a new king because they had divine connections. They were the ones who connected with the gods. They were the ones who looked into the future. Those were the ones who looked and saw, have our gods approved the king or not? And so when they come all the way saying that according to our writings that we have, we believe that this and that was going to happen, and now we've seen this star that we were expecting, which Daniel must have taught them about, and therefore we're now here looking for another king. We want to give approval, our assent to his position as king, and we've come to bless him, to worship him. We've come to give him gifts as a sign of our approval of his kingship. And Herod says, this is too much. Someone's going to steal the throne from me and my family. And so he sends these men, quite wisely himself. He sends them out to look. Now, it's quite possible that they were accompanied by their own Persian army as well to protect them. It was a dangerous journey that they were going on, and probably an official journey at that. So they would have had probably, a protection around them as well. So if Herod lashed out at them, this would be war. So he couldn't just take them out of the situation. So he says, cunningly, you go, the sly old fox that he was. You go. He says, you go and look for the child, and when you find him, come back. Let me know where he is, that I may go and worship him too. And you know, and I know the story, of course, that they were warned in a dream after they found him to go back by a different route to their own country. Herod, realizing that he'd been outwitted, then brings in his devastating act where he killed the children. And that again was prophesied in Scripture, where it talks about Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, for they are no more. And this was indeed the sign of Rachel's children. And that prophecy is being fulfilled in a couple of different ways, but that's for another time. But look, here's the thing, that these men come from outside of Israel. They come representing the nations, and they come with their gifts of gold and of incense and of myrrh. And people have seen different things that the gifts represent. And again, I'm not going to go into all of that today, but it's understandable why they're seen as that. There's biblical precedence for it. But the thing is, as they come, they represent the non-Jews. And the thing is that right from the very start, when God created his own people, he said to Abraham, I'm going to make you up into a great nation. He says, I'm going to bless you, and you are going to be a blessing to the nations. Then he promised through David, and we've been looking at God's promise through David, the Davidic covenant. He says to David, also he says that he will come, and he's going to take his crown, his throne, as king of the nations. It's all there. That he was going to extend the boundary of Messiah to include many nations around. And right up to this very day, there are people from all over the world now who can come and worship the great King. No longer is he just King of the Jews, though he is that. But we're told in Revelation that he has many crowns upon his head. It's not just the crown of the Jews. It's the crown of all the nations. That he has actually shown himself to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so at Christmas time, as we're looking for the King to come, And as we've looked through the various prophecies and predictions that this great king is coming in the form of Jesus Christ, remember that he doesn't stay a baby. A baby is powerless, actually. Think about that. A baby is powerless. Jesus could not stay as a baby. He had to come as a baby in human form. But he grew up. And he didn't just grow up, but he then went all the way to the cross, where, of course, they mocked him by putting a crown of thorns upon his head. He said he was the king of the Jews. Well, then let's give him a crown. And they mocked him. But, of course, what they didn't realize is that no matter how much they mocked him with that crown of thorns, that actually one day he was going to take a crown that can never be destroyed, that will be put upon his head. They had failed to see that just a week before his crucifixion and resurrection, all that, at Easter, that he had entered Jerusalem as the king. Slightly veiled, perhaps, and only those with their eyes wide open would have seen it. Yet he came as the Messiah King into Jerusalem. And the wonderful thing is, and one of the reasons I think it's important that we keep celebrating the coming of Christ in his first coming, his infancy, is because it's part of a much bigger picture of a story, but it leads us on to think about when he comes again. That Jesus is not finished. Okay, he's not finished with us. He's not finished with his program. This was only a small part of it that we've been looking at. And that now he looks to come back a second time. He looks to come back and to reign upon the earth. He looks to come back not as King of the Jews. And when he comes back this second time, he's going to come back. It will be the brightness of his dawning again, yes, but not with a little tiny star up in the sky that just a few obscure magi see and recognize and come looking for him. But it says that every eye will see him because the brightness of his coming will be so much. His epiphany, we sometimes call it. And epiphany means this brightness, this dazzling brightness, that when he comes again, he says, he's not going to come veiled and hidden, but everyone will see him. And when they do, it says that every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. At this time, only a few came and bowed the knee and confessed before him. But a time will come when everyone will do so. And in the meantime, this is where God is so good to us, that he has shown us and allowed us to see and to study and to learn and to discover for ourselves that Jesus is not just a good teacher. The Christmas story is not just a nice, warm story of a good overcoming evil or something like that. But this is all part of God's huge plan that he has for the whole of creation and that he always has had right since the beginning. In fact, even since before the day he said, "Let there be light," as recorded back in Genesis, God already knew where it was going. Now, some people have said to me, if God knew how this earth would be and why that it would be such a disaster, if you like, and needed saving, why did he go through with the plan? I don't know the answer. You're going to have to ask him that yourself. But what I know is that God knows everything. He knows from the beginning, he knows the end. There is nothing hidden from his eyes. And so therefore the whole of the Bible is a wonderful story of how God takes and looks after the whole of humanity. How he watches it right from the beginning, how he sees it mess up and he says, but I'm putting my plan into action to make sure that you can be saved through it. And the big message of Christmas for each one of us is, and it's a poignant remembrance once every year, is that the Saviour came. Are you prepared to bow the knee? Are you prepared to come to him and say, I recognize you for who you really are? I recognize that when you came all those years ago as a baby in the manger, that you were not just an ordinary baby, that you were indeed the Son of God. I recognize that when you grew up and started teaching, that you were still the Messiah, the Son of God, who came to bring us the good news. And it wasn't just about moral teaching that we can follow, but he came to show us another way completely. Recognize that he came to show us that this was not just for one singled out particular nation that God had favoured above all the others and nobody else got a look in, but Jesus actually came to bring salvation to everybody. And to recognise that that story still goes on and we are part of that. We're part of God's history. And that even today the Bible speaks about people like us, may not name you individually, but it talks about our time. It talks about the time between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. It talks about how God is going to use the nations around in order to bring his glory. It talks about how he's going to send his gospel out to the whole of the world and that people everywhere will believe. It's all there. We are living in exciting times. And I just urge you more than anything else today to say this, that if you've not done so yet, discover the King. Look for him. Search him out. Don't go looking up into the skies. There are still mad people, you know, who are still looking up into the skies, looking at the stars, thinking that God is revealing his future, his truth through the stars. They see some of the interpretation of the book of Revelation as being the various constellations. That when it talks about the woman and the dragon in chapter 12 of Revelation, that it's actually talking about the constellations up there. It's talking about Virgo and certain stars that appear to be above her head. Come on, folks, it's not about that at all. It's nothing to do with that. It's looking at the Word of God. This is how God has chosen to speak to us. If you want to discover the King, look no further than your Bible. Read it thoroughly. I want to encourage you to read it through. New Year is always a good time to make that start on reading the Scriptures through. Now, I know that normally with a book, most people will start at the beginning and they'll work their way through to the end. I don't necessarily suggest that's a good way of reading the Bible, but if that's how you want to do it, that's fine. But usually by Leviticus we get a bit bogged down. But I would suggest if you're not used to reading the Bible, at least start with the New Testament. Just read it through. If you can go a bit more than that and you want to read some of the new, some of the old, well, that's great too. There are lots of plans out there for Bible reading. Just go to the internet, Bible reading plan. There's loads of things there that you can download. Stuff in Bible bookshops as well to help you read through. But I just encourage you, why not this new year start to discover the King? Look for him deeply. One of the problems that many of us have is that we're so shallow with our search of the Scriptures. We're so shallow with our study of the Bible that we love the stories of Jesus. We like to look at the parables and put very simplistic understandings to them. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I think many of them are very simplistic understandings. But don't forget that that's more than just moral teaching. The Bible is there to guide you. The Bible is there to open your eyes. Do you know when Jesus returns, we're told that he's going to come like a thief in the night? You know that, don't you? And what do we know about the thief coming in the night? Well, when the thief comes in the night, he comes because nobody's expecting him. Is that right? So most thieves will still strike at night. I know that, they steal in broad daylight today as well. They're really quite brazen. And I think some of them have realised sometimes it's easier to do it in broad daylight because nobody suspects you're doing something wrong than at night time. But still, traditionally, thieves come at night when they are not expected, when people are asleep. But, Thessalonians tells us that for the believer, it's different. For the world around us, for those who are not looking, it's like they're asleep, that they've not expected his coming. But, it says he will come like a thief in the night, but not to you, because you're children of the day and children of the light. You will see his coming. Nobody knows the day nor the hour. Jesus said that himself. Jesus said not even the angels in heaven, nor even, he says, the Son himself knows that. Only the Father has that secret. He's kept that secret. He knows when the end will come. But he says, you can look out, you can search, you can see the indications that Jesus is coming back. Discover the King before it's too late. Look for him with all your heart. Seek him with all your being. Search deeply into the scriptures. Don't read superstitiously into it, but read wisely into it. Ask questions of things you don't know. Mark things that are curious to you and ask other people about it who might know. But search for him. You will be absolutely amazed and blessed at how much the Bible tells you about the coming of our King, the Lord Jesus Christ. Let's pray.